If you've been gaming since the PS2 era or earlier, you've likely heard the name Fatal Frame at least once. You also might have heard such words as ghosts and camera commonly used when talking about it. For most people, that's it for their knowledge of the series, and as a huge fan of it, I think it deserves more recognition. So to clarify what it's all about, here's my serious overview for Fatal Frame. Fatal Frame, also known in Europe as Project Zero, is a horror video game franchise developed by the folks at Koei Tecmo, with the series' creator being Makoto Shibata, a horror enthusiast who's previously worked on the Tecmo's Deception series. Alongside his colleague Keisuke Kikuchi, who took on the duties of the producer for the series, Shibata-san to this day stands as the driving force behind Fatal Frame, as he directed each and every mainline game in the series. As of 2017, the franchise consists of 5 main installments, 1 remaster and 1 spin-off. Also, despite being very niche, in the past few years Fatal Frame has grown into a small media franchise with novels, manga, and even a full-length live-action film. Each entry has you explore a haunted Japanese location from the third-person perspective, usually as a young girl equipped with a camera capable of banishing ghosts. You run around the place, uncover ghostly secrets, solve occasional puzzles, and fend off hostile spirits by taking pictures of them. Don't worry, we'll get to that. It all started almost 2 decades ago when the company formerly known as just Tecmo was first introduced to the PlayStation 2 hardware. Having just finished his previous work, Tecmo's Deception Invitation to Darkness, Makoto Shibata got an idea for a game about ghosts, and fueled by his passion towards the supernatural, the development process had been started. The main focus for the team was to make the most terrifying game possible. The game got a codename Project Zero, and upon release was officially named Zero in Japan, with North America getting a more creative title, Fatal Frame, which both makes sense in the context of the game and sounds badass, while in Europe, well, in Europe they just went with the initial codename. Now, being a horror game and all, Fatal Frame definitely stood out among other games in the genre at the time. Not only was it one of the few games primarily about fighting ghosts, it didn't feature any sort of melee combat like in your Resident Evils and Silent Hills. Your only way of defending yourself was a dangerous artifact known as the Camera Obscura, which wasn't even in the initial discussions between Shibata and Kikuchi. It was originally planned that the player would avoid ghosts or repel them with light. Those are the concepts that revisit in later installments. You take photos of spirits to deal them damage. That's the basic premise, and the entire combat system was designed around this gimmick. In the original game it's pretty simplistic, but each game in this series makes some sort of a spin on it, or even changes it completely in the case of Fatal Frame 5. While the combat was certainly unique, for most people it's not exactly the reason they have such fond memories of playing Fatal Frame. The unforgettable atmosphere of dread is. I could try and describe it the best way I can, but I'd probably give it a huge disservice due to the language barrier, so it's better if you see it for yourself. Now is a good time to take note of some of the series' specifics. Fatal Frame is not for everybody. First of all, it's very slow-paced. If you gravitate towards more action-oriented horror games, you'll likely find Fatal Frame just boring. Secondly, I know it's a horror game series, but it has to be mentioned. It contains a lot of disturbing imagery with realistic depictions of heavily maimed and wounded people. Its stories are always full of tragedy and there's a lot of suicide in them. If you're sensitive towards this kind of content, this might not be the series for you. Lastly, I feel obliged to inform you of some of the series' main flaws. Every game in the series is guilty of backtracking and repetition in general. You'll be revisiting the same places and fighting the same enemies multiple times. A lot of people are annoyed with the controls in these games. The English voice dub is 50-50 in many cases.
The forbidden rituals of this area. It looks like Mr. Takamine was doing research into them. I wonder if his group is still here.
I personally can be pretty forgiving of some of these issues because I like everything else so much, but I understand if this turns some people off. Despite many of the flaws I mentioned present in it, Fatal Frame 1 was a success. The game was met with critical acclaim, with Shibata and Kikuchi noting it was an unexpected success in both Europe and the States, so they almost immediately started working on expanding their IP. A year after that, the game saw release on the OG Xbox. The Xbox version brought a lot of new things to the original game. A new ending, a new difficulty setting, more hidden ghosts, diaries and unlockables, and is a more complete package as a result. About a year later, the world saw Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly on PlayStation 2. The game was a huge improvement over the original, with a greater emphasis on the story and everything that put the first game on the map intact. Fantastic atmosphere, memorable enemy encounters, and of course so much death in the air you can't breathe. Crimson Butterfly was very well received by both fans and critics. It is the highest rated game in the series and a fan favorite for most of us Fatal Framers. It's also often regarded as one of the scariest games of all time, which is subjective of course, but a lot of people do tend to say that. In a similar fashion to the first game, an enhanced version of it came out on the OG Xbox a year after its release. With a new ending, more alternate costumes, a survival mode, and oddly enough a first-person mode. Just a bit more content for those who crave it. Again, a year went by and Fatal Frame 3 The Tormented came out for PlayStation 2. The game was met with positive reception but didn't really manage to surpass its predecessor. It was different, yeah, featuring multiple protagonists, returning characters from both previous games and the Silent Hill Fall Lake hub area. It was something not everyone was happy about. Crimson Butterfly might be a superior horror title, but The Tormented is still a great game with its own strengths, and its release concluded the PS2 trilogy. Unlike Fatal Frame 1 and 2 though, it sadly did not receive an Xbox port, probably due to the 360 being right around the corner when it came out. And then, something unexpected happened. In 2008, Fatal Frame 4 was announced, exclusively for Nintendo Wii. I couldn't find any explanation online as to why they didn't stick with the multi-platform approach, outside of the fact that Shibata and Kikuchi were seemingly very excited about the prospect of using the Wii Remote to make you feel horror with your body. Also, for the first time in the series, Tecmo wasn't working on a Fatal Frame game alone, but rather in collaboration with Grasshopper Manufacture and Nintendo. Yes, Nintendo was directly involved in the development of this game, and Grasshopper's very own Geiichi Suda was credited as director alongside Shibata. How or why it was done the way it was remains a mystery to this day. But of course, as any fan of the series will tell you, that's not the worst part of the story. Fatal Frame Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, which is the direct translation of its official title, has never been released outside of Japan. Nobody was willing to publish this game in the West, not even Nintendo themselves. Thankfully, in 2010, a group of dedicated fans translated the game and created a patch that allows you to bypass Wii's region lock, so people could import it and play it without pirating it. Unfortunately, the translation wasn't perfect, likely because the Japanese use in Fatal Frame 4 is old and isn't being used anymore. And whether it's that or the fact that 3 different teams were working on this game and it was a complete mess of a development process. Anyone who's ever played Mask of the Lunar Eclipse in English will tell you it's the most confusing thing ever. Although that won't stop you from enjoying its excellent audiovisual presentation, of course. With that being said, I'm still extremely grateful that this patch exists, since there's no other way to experience this game for those who don't speak Japanese. Despite all the misfortune, Fatal Frame 4 is probably the most important game in the series. It was a turning point for the franchise, with not only the change in the publisher, but also in some of its fundamental aspects. The game got rid of fixed camera angles in favor of the over-the-shoulder perspective, which made it feel more modern. The setting and architecture were now more Western-inspired rather than traditional Japanese, and the general character design was revised to give the protagonists a more realistic look. All these changes definitely made the game stand out compared to its predecessors. But Shibata himself noted that they've basically been doing the same thing for 3 games now, and he is ultimately glad that they got to work with 2 other companies with different visions because it allowed them to create a truly new experience. After what happened with Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, Fatal Frame's future looked grim. However, 4 years after its release, things finally started to change. 2012 was a big year for the series. It was revealed that Nintendo forged some sort of a relationship with Tecmo regarding the Fatal Frame IP. I don't feel comfortable in outright stating what kind of relationship that is. I couldn't find any official confirmation Nintendo actually co-owns the franchise now. But since then, every new game in the series came out only on their platforms, and I feel like it's going to continue that way. I'm willing to bet it has something to do with the publishing affairs. While Tecmo is listed as publisher of the first 3 games in Japan and the States, in Europe, each PS2 entry was published by a different company. Take-Two Interactive, Ubisoft, whatever the hell Wanna-Do is. Since Nintendo has published every single Fatal Frame game starting with Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, it seems very likely that it's just easier for Tecmo to stick with the big N, so I wouldn't hope for any future games to appear on PlayStation or even Xbox. The world saw 2 major releases in the series in 2012. The first one was Spirit Camera The Cursed Memoir, a 3DS spin-off that used the system's augmented reality capabilities to literally turn your 3DS into a camera obscura. The game wasn't well received, but if your apartment is haunted, you might as well give it a go. Having no Fatal Frame name attached to it, it came out in all 3 regions. The second one was the Wii edition of Fatal Frame 2, the remaster I mentioned earlier. Wherever I look, people refer to it as a remake, but it's not really true. It's the same game as the original, but with the visual changes introduced to the series with Fatal Frame 4, the over-the-shoulder camera, and the redesigned, more realistic-looking character models. A number of new endings has been added, and the CGI cutscenes had to be redone to accommodate the new look of the characters. There's also a bunch of new details and little touches in the game that help it feel more fresh. It was the first Fatal Frame title to come out in Europe in over 6 years, with all the text and dialogue completely retranslated and re-recorded for the English release. The fans of the series in the States were left out once again, but I would argue that the sheer fact it was localized in English at all was a sign that the series was on its way to recovery. In the course of 2013, each game of the PS2 trilogy was re-released on PS3 via PlayStation Network in North America. No word on the European release was given, again probably due to the publishing issues. In 2014, Fatal Frame 5 was announced for Wii U. The game came out the same year in Japan, and it took it 1 more year to see release in the West, with its official subtitle being Maiden of Black Water. This time it was finally brought to both Europe and America, though in the States it was digital only, which is why Fatal Frame's reappearance in North America after 10 years was met with less rejoice and more anger and confusion. Both critics and fans had mixed feelings about Fatal Frame 5. The story has definitely been done better in previous games, but the gameplay is easily the best in the series. Some people were annoyed with the control scheme, but others really liked using the Wii gamepad as the camera obscura. There's a lot of repetition and backtracking, especially in the second half of the game, but then again, all Fatal Frame games are guilty of that. I personally think it's a great game, and though people were very much divided on it, Maiden of Blackwater did bring Fatal Frame back from oblivion for a lot of folks, and is now the latest installment in the series. And in 2016, the Wii edition of Fatal Frame 2 was made available on Wii U as a digital download in Europe. Now I know what you're probably thinking. That's a hell of a lot of different systems. And yeah, it is. But the nice thing about this series is that most of the games in it aren't connected to one another story-wise. So if you have access to one of them, you don't really need to play any of the other ones to enjoy it. I would name Fatal Frame 3 as the only exception here. I'd recommend experiencing 1 and 2 first. Even then, each game has a new main protagonist with her own storyline, so don't worry too much about it. As for which one should be your first, I'd say just go for the one that's the easiest for you to get. See if you like it or not, and then decide if it's worth going after the more difficult to find ones. If you have a PS3 with a North American PSN account, the original PS2 trilogy is waiting for you to be downloaded. If you happen to have an OG Xbox, definitely get the enhanced versions of 1 and 2. If you're one of the few Wii U owners and you bought it in the PAL territories, 2 and 5 are there for you. The least accessible one has to be 4. If you want to play it authentically, you'll have to spend an insane amount of money on importing it from Japan. It's ridiculously expensive. If you'd like to hear a comprehensive breakdown of this game's story rather than play it for yourself, I encourage you to visit the Exorsizzle Explains channel, where you can find multiple videos on this game. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it helped you learn more about Fatal Frame. It's a criminally underrated series, and if you're a fan of Japanese horror games, especially the ones with atmospheric and absorbing stories of death, loss and insanity, Fatal Frame is your kind of game.